All right. Now today we're going to talk about roots of imperialism. Remember I said that imperialism and progressivism are happening simultaneously. So this actually poses a big problem because we're trying to progress in society, and it seems like we're going backwards in a sense of going back to imperialism. So we're going to start way at the beginning here, and then we're going to work our way through this, and hopefully we like it. This is a difficult concept for a lot of people to understand, so please let's try to get this. All right. Now, to understand imperialism, we have to go back to Washington. George Washington is our first president, and in his farewell address, he said, he warned us of dangers of party. He said, don't have an unbalanced budget, don't get involved in foreign affairs, don't make enemies or alliances, expensive wars, or false patriotism. Now, we've seen all that stuff come to pass. But in essence, the thing we really need to understand here is, in his farewell address, he says, don't get involved in foreign affairs. Don't get foreign entanglement. And it's a policy that we call isolationism, or we call it neutrality. And even at the beginning of both world wars, we are what we call neutral. So Washington farewell, I want you to have, he says, watch out for foreign entanglements. And then isolationism is staying away from everybody, okay? Now, this is kind of our policy for a long time until, and now keep in mind, for foreign entanglements, we don't tell anybody anything. James Monroe becomes president, and he issues something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, if we understand anything about this country, we understand that the French and Spanish were here long before us, and also the Spanish are in South America. At this time, we see the rise of some South American, Central American independence movements. And so President Monroe issues something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, a doctrine is nothing more than something that is said by somebody. So this is something Monroe said, and this is a very important thing. Let me show you here. The Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1823. And look at what he's telling the rest of the world. He said, South America, North America is, quote, what? Hands off. Do you see that? And who is he telling it to? He's saying it to the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, Asia, etc. He's basically saying this divide, which makes us hemispheres, should stay in play, and that no one from these hemispheres should come meddle over here. Now, that's moving away from isolationism. However, we're not going in there and doing anything. We're basically saying just leave them alone. Okay? Now, why would we have to tell them to leave alone? Europe, particularly Europe, had become involved in what is called colonialism. And colonialism is basically they would come over and find a country that would work for them. Now, again, we have here Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. Monroe's thrown his hat down kind of to claim it, right? But the idea of colonialism is having people work for you. And it's another thing from imperialism. Here's another Monroe Doctrine. I found a whole lot of Monroe Doctrine. I like this. But let's look at colonial Africa, for example, okay? Africa we have is controlled by Portugal. We have Spain over here. We have France, Italy, England's in here, of course, Germany. And they basically carved this country up and made them work for them and mine them and different things. And eventually they're going to start coming back at them. So the idea was, in the Monroe Doctrine, not to let colonialism come over here. There was a line you couldn't cross. It's the Western Hemisphere. So please, I hope we have that understood. Monroe Doctrine, a line is drawn. The powers of Eastern Hemisphere cannot come into the Western Hemisphere to claim, and we're afraid of colonialism. Okay? Let's move on. Now, a very important man, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred T. Mahan. Okay? Writes a book. He wrote many books. But the main one I want to focus on here is the influence of sea power upon history. In this, he talks about the feared Spanish Armada and the British Navy of Queen Victoria's time, Sir Francis Drake, etc., how they got here, right? He basically said, if you want to be a world power, you've got to have the biggest navy. And we listen to that. All right, so Alfred T. Mahan is telling us if the United States wants to be a major power, we have to build a navy. We're going to get into how that comes about here later on. Now, the other thing we're also concerning ourselves with is a Middle American Canal. We wanted a canal that would connect the Pacific Ocean with the Atlantic Ocean via the Caribbean Sea. And we have picked two places. The first place we pick here is Nicaragua, and we also pick Panama. Now, ultimately, we will decide on Panama, and we'll get into how that happens. But the idea of a Middle American canal, I want you to have Nicaragua and Panama, and the idea is to connect the Pacific with the Atlantic Ocean, not just for safety, but also to get around quickly. Okay? Now, what happened, and this is mainly China and places like that, countries began with their colonial, not to make it colonialism, but to have what is called a sphere of influence, which in the same country, different countries control. This is China. And see here, this orange part is the Portuguese, we have the British, we have the Russians, the Japanese, the Germans, and the French. So in one country, if I go from here down to here, I've got to know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different languages just to be able to trade. And that poses a little bit of a problem, right? Now, at the same time that we're telling people to stay away from us, we begin to do as Mahan said, and we begin to want to have people to trade with us. And we used our Navy. It is called gunboat diplomacy. Okay? So gunboat diplomacy, all right, is where you're going to rely on foreign trade by almost intimidating by the size of your Navy. Okay? So, who was the one in charge of that? His name was Matthew Perry. Matthew Perry was the first real success of gunboat diplomacy because what he did is he got a former hermit kingdom completely shut up to trade with us. And it is this country, Japan. So he got Japan to trade with us by using gunboat diplomacy. In essence, here's Tokyo. It used to be called Edo back in the day. He came in, he sailed up into here, and he said, we need you to trade with us. And they said, no, we don't have any use for anything the Americans made. He goes back, the president says, no, you go back, you make them trade, gunboat diplomacy. So he sailed the gunboats up into here, and he said, either you trade with us, or we're going to destroy the port. He didn't come out flat and say, we're going to destroy the port. More or less, it was more of a threat, and the Japanese perceived that, understood, and they are going to begin to trade with us. Now, an interesting thing, I have a sister-in-law who went to Japan on a mission trip, and they still have this concept of Americans. They see Americans as warmongers, meaning they want to fight. And this was some 200 years on later, but I mean, this is what they have been telling their children, and maybe they have a right to say that. So that is kind of the beginning of our imperialism. We're forcing ourselves. We're going to see how it kind of expands going forward.